Hit start streaming, and it should.
Excuse me.
Oh,
There we go. What happened was it started streaming before it was ready, and so it didn't.
oh, that's what it is.
Yeah, that's a safe. YouTube is more of a pain in the rear to get going.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's owned by Google, so that can't
Point-
be wonderful.
Point of order, your background says third Saturday.
All right,
Debate
you're
there.
on the air.
Okay. All right.
Wonderful. Now we have with our four angles here. I feel like we should be able to sing the Brady Bunch song or something. So, hail and well met, everyone. Welcome to the Ea Tolkien Society of the Inland Northwest, and for our friends who are joining us online. Go ahead and, for those who might be listening in from elsewhere, go ahead and share your name and where you're at or whatever you want to share. Maybe a little bit, could you just share, so for both Chris and Gary, briefly, where you're coming from and your connection, like maybe how did you first get connected to reading the works of J.r.r. Tolkien?
Okay, does that work for you?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Chris, why don't you go first?
It's youtube.com
Okay.
/Tolkien Scholars.
My name is Chris Cooperstein.
This is on YouTube.
I
Good
am
story.
a recovering Tolkienist, and you never recover from that. And I've been part of this group for more than 10 years, I think, at this point, and have thoroughly enjoyed everything through the years.
Okay.
I distinctly remember being read The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit sitting in my father's bed at age 4 or 5. As I was falling asleep. And so that means I missed some of the story, and I had to go back in junior high and read it again, and go back in college and read it again. So
Is that Linux?
Yeah, this is what
now I'm relatively well versed, and now I'm starting to go through the other works of his slowly as time permits.
Very good. Thanks, Chris and Gary.
I'm Gary Haglund. I live in Mountain Home, Idaho. And I was introduced to Tolkien, the Hobbit, in my year, as it turned out, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, when these
fun, everybody.
two
Yeah, thank you.
weird friends recommended it to me. They were also helped out. I think they volunteered for the county coroner. They were morticians type helpers or something. But anyway, from there I was hooked, and that was in 1965. So I've been a Tolkien fanatic for quite some time. I've read The Hobbit 5 or 6 times, and I'm currently reading the Lord of the Rings trilogy for something like the 5th time. So, yeah, it never gets old.
Wonderful.
And, I have read the Silmarillion, and I managed to stay awake, but anyway, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Very good. Anthony.
Hello. Can you you guys online hear me?
Yes, Ken.
Okay, cool. Hi, my name is Anthony. I'm from the East Farthing. I've been a member of Tolkien Society. Well, I've been coming to these meetings for about almost 6 years now. I joined the International Tolkien Society 2 years ago. And for my first encounter with The Lord of the Rings, I think I read a little bit of The Hobbit in 5th grade or so, but it was the Peter Jackson films that really got me into the Lord of the Rings as a kid. And I kind of read some of the Two Towers and the Return of the King concurrently as the films were coming out. But it wasn't until college that I really delved deeply into Tolkien himself. You know, I started reading the Hobbit the entire way, and then The Lord of the Rings, including the appendices, and then the Silmarillion, which I consider his masterpiece, and then some of his posthumously published writings edited by Christopher Tolkien, like the Unfinished Tales and Children of Hurin, and eventually most of the History of Middle Earth series. And so now I consider myself almost a full-blown Tolkien scholar without any sort of professorship or anything. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Yep, that's great. Joey, did you want to say anything about The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings? Have you seen the movies or read any of the books?
I ended up watching the Hobbit and all that, the animated version,
No, it's smart.
and then the
Brian, I can't hear him.
Go ahead. What were you saying?
So I ended up watching the cartoon version of it when I was a kid with my parents. My dad got me actually into the whole series as well as the books.
Great.
And it was a lot of fun being able to sit down and actually read a book with my father.
That's a great thing. Yeah, that's like the family piece of it, which Chris mentioned earlier. And for me, it was I remember it pretty well. It was about 1981. I was in Moscow, Idaho, and I had walked into Walden Books, I think, but it wasn't in. I think it was actually not in Walden Books. It was at a music store, a record store, someplace like that, in the mall, that first mall in Moscow. And I remember, aside from getting an Orange Julius and a maple bar, that there was the little book for kids that went along with the Rankin Bass Hobbit animated cartoon, and it had the little would that be a 45, right, record, and so you could play it on a record player and turn the page when the little sound comes. So anyway, that was my introduction to The Hobbit. I fell in love with the story. So it's really interesting to hear how, whether it was through the mixed media, cartoons, movies, the books, different entrances to Tolkien's work. But eventually I came to to the books and read them and just enjoyed them very much. And I would agree with what people have said. At different ages and different times of my life, I've really found different works more accessible. So now I feel like I have a better grasp of kind of the way he thought in his legendarium. But certainly The Hobbit was kind of the easiest entrance point, followed by The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion. But just really found Tolkien to be a writer who, because he's drawing, and we'll be talking about some of this today, because he's drawing on and inspired by things much older than himself, that lends a timeless quality to Tolkien's work, which I think explains in part his appeal to so many people and why it's been translated into so many different languages and then several different film versions, because of the fact that he's not just making it up all on his own, but he's taking something from the past and he's reimagining it. So anyway, that's my part of the piece there. So if there's nothing else, Anthony, I can go ahead and read notes if that sounds good to you.
Absolutely, yeah.
Great. All right, so let's jump into the notes from last time we met, which was in February, because in March we had to postpone our meeting due to the St. Patrick's Day parade that RPG Research was taking part in. So on February 11th, 2023, Chris, Anthony, Gary, and I don't have down, I have Anthony's name twice. That might have been because there were two screens.
That's right, yeah.
But it was maybe just the three of us. No, it'd be me. That's who's missing.
Yes.
Chris, Anthony, Gary, and Brian. I was there. And I read the January notes. We went over some housekeeping items, and then we revisited our purpose. The idea was that let's have do some thinking about our purpose, and then come back to this. What is the purpose of the Tolkien Society? And then the next part of that is just promotion and recruitment. How can we do a better job at helping people know about the Tolkien Society? Because unfortunately, we're not very visible. And we want to try to create a more visible kind of profile. Then we moved on to news. We talked about a number of different things that are in the news about related to Tolkien. For example, the Facebook news from the University of Oxford about j.r.r. Tolkien being fined for his overdue library book. That was pretty funny. And then also a company in the United Kingdom called Lord of the Bins, and how it was ordered to change its name by the Tolkien franchise, proving that any kind of encroachment will be seen as a threat by the Tolkien estate, which is now called, I think, Middle Earth Enterprises DBA. I'm not sure about that. And also great news that this year there will be a Tolkien coin, which will be minted by the Royal Mint in England. So that'll be fun to look forward to. We talked about how the wealth of a nation is also its cultural treasures, not just its money. Hello, John.
Hello.
John Welker, VP of RPGresearch.com, just walked in. And so we're just going over the notes right now from last time we met, which was in February, since March was the St. Patrick's Day Parade.
Yay.
Yay. And maybe we can get an update from you if that's okay after this.
For the St. Patrick's Day parade?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay. So anyway, to continue on, another thing that we talked about was that Lego, no stranger to cashing in on on significant cinematic moments. Continuing on from earlier Lego sets based on the Lord of the Rings, since they have a license. There was a link to a news story about the one Lego set to rule them all, which I think was Rivendell, that's right, which was quite extensive and beautiful, but I couldn't help feeling a little cynical, only because it's crazy price that they're asking for, hundreds of dollars. But then we knew this back in the day when they made the Millennium Falcon, right?
Yeah, we've had $300 sets for quite a while now.
Inflation, yeah. Eventually, outreaches, it's a collector item is what it is, right?
Yeah, make sure when those two are speaking, you hand the microphone to them.
Yeah, we'll do. I'm just getting through the notes here, and then I'll pass it on.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, okay, so Beowulf. The main focus last time was Beowulf and its influence on j.r.r. Tolkien. For example, we talked about the different translations of Beowulf. Tolkien actually made his own translation, but there are several other good ones. We used the Seamus Heaney one, I believe. Mm-hmm. That was good to read. But there have been a number of modern English translations of this old English classic. We talked about films that were based on Beowulf. The 2015 one, which was rather poor from all reports, and but a good animated one that was made in 1998 that was not too bad. We talked about the context of Beowulf, dating this to I believe it was the 7th century, somewhere in that neighborhood. 7th to 8th?
Yeah, well, the manuscript itself.
Oh, yes, much later.
In which the Beowulf was written, was probably produced around the year 1000.
Mm-hmm.
But the poem itself was written closer to the 8th or 9th century.
8th or 9th century.
Or 10th century.
Yeah. And it's reaching back to the historical background where kind of a blend of real people, Hrothgar, Hugelac, the Shieldings, these are all real 6th century people in Scandinavia. But mythological aspects such as Beowulf, Grendel, etc. And then archaeology can confirm parts of the story. So kind of like almost an earlier Robin Hood. It's
Yeah.
this story that kind of grows into a legend.
Or King Arthur.
Or King Arthur, very good. Yeah, that's probably a closer example.
Did they find the mead hall or something? What archaeology did they have? Did they find the mead hall? What kind of archaeology did they locate?
Yeah, I don't remember that. Does anybody remember what we had discussed about the archaeology?
I think there's been a lot of archaeological diggings, in Denmark, Norway,
Mm-hmm.
and Sweden, in which the poem is set.
Yeah, I think the idea of the hall and Heorot, something like that, was actually built.
Yeah, remains of Viking longhouses as well as ship burials.
Yeah.
But any that could be specifically tied to Beowulf, the story?
Perhaps to Beowulf's time, but I'm not sure to the exact. I believe Hrothgar, was it Hrothgar or Hugelac? It might be based on a real person, but I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. So good question. What actually is there? I would point you to, there's a website called Danish Archaeologists Find Traces of Beowulf Legend, and I think it was saying that they found remnants of an ancient royal hall that may have inspired the English epic poem.
Yeah.
So I think that's really what that means, is more that the inspiration, kind of what is the historical seed of the story. Much like going back to the King Arthur mention, maybe physical locations that some people have pointed to and said, okay, maybe this is Camelot, right? Yeah. So, yeah, good question. Okay, so just to bring the notes to an end here, and then we can have some follow-up discussion and things. We talked about how Beowulf was written for an English audience about their ancestors, who, of course, had immigrated from the mainland of Northern Europe. And it was composed by a West Saxon dialect-speaking Christian poet. We talked about the criticism and interpretation of Beowulf over the centuries. Many have only treated it as a trove for historical facts, others as just a story that is fabricated. Tolkien's view as a literary work is definitely unique. He kind of promoted a different view, and there's a link to that in the notes here. And this is really kind of encapsulated in his work, Monsters and Critics, which is really Tolkien, some speeches he gave, some talks he gave on the worth of why we should study Beowulf. So we kind of take it for granted nowadays that Beowulf is one of these key pieces of English literature, but it wasn't always seen that way, right? And so anyway, I won't get into the details, but it's worth reading in the Monsters and Critics. There's this allegory that Tolkien mentions that we talked about in February about a man building a tower, and then something knocks it down later, and then there's all these people kind of debating about like why these stones were there. So Tolkien feels that we need to care about story itself, that the development of story in Old English is important because it tells us a lot about what the people believed was important, like, for example, loyalty or honor or even power, etc. So what influence on Tolkien did Beowulf have? We noted that there's only two good dragon tales in Anglo-Saxon, Beowulf and Fafnir. Farmer Giles of Ham is a fun tale by Tolkien about a dragon called Chrysophylax. He also has, of course, other dragons that he includes in his stories. Other examples of influence on Tolkien, Beowulf, literally, it means wolf or a bear. And the bear man in Tolkien's work would be
Beorn.
Here we go, Beorn. And then you have rings, the idea that kings are ring givers in Beowulf, but also that's true in The Lord of the Rings, or at least in the background of the Silmarillion. You have the idea of the rings being given as a gift. Of course, that's being twisted and corrupted through Sauron. The dragon jealous of his hoard. Well, that's, of course, in Beowulf, and we see a direct kind of correlation to Smaug, the Magnificent, brooding over his hoard in Lonely Mountain or Erebor. The two lanterns of the world that are mentioned in the story of Beowulf, referring there to the sun and the moon. You could see perhaps a parallel in how in the Silmarillion, early on, the world of Arda, there were 2 twin pillars. And of course, those are destroyed by Sauron, and so then the twin trees, the 2 trees are created. So there may be some reference there, who knows, and some unintentional references. So why remember Beowulf? In conclusion, we discussed how this is a classic story of good versus evil, a story of what a hero should aspire to be. Beowulf is a good challenge that required Tolkien to go back to the source. And also, it's a cool read from 1,000 years ago. Yeah. With moral value. How does one face death matters. Altruism, being willing to put yourself in danger for the sake of others. And of course, that northern virtue of courage, which mattered a lot to the writer of Beowulf and to Tolkien as well. And we discussed that the next meeting in March would cover the next few sources from the Middle Ages, starting with the Poetic Edda. And those are the end of the notes. So as far as a discussion, could I have maybe an update, since we didn't meet last month, from John Welker, talking a little bit about the St. Patrick's Day Parade?
Well, we did the St. Patrick's Day Parade as an opportunity to display the RPG Mobile, which is the 3 vehicles that we have. You can go to rpgmobile.com to find more information about the vehicles. But they are wheelchair accessible recreation locations where we play role-playing games or do drum circles and things like that. We have 1 bus and 2 trailers, and we used 1 bus to pull the trailer, and we used Hawk's SUV to pull the other trailer, decorated it with Irish flags and green and other ribbons on there just to make them look pretty. It was pretty successful on our part. We handed out every flyer that we had, and we had some people film. When we filmed ourselves, it was really interesting to watch other people going, taking a double take because they never seen us in the parade before. I was dressed as a leprechaun, or at least that's what everybody told me when I was there.
Thanks, John. Well, that's really interesting. I'm sure that it was nice to get more visibility for what you guys are doing here. And of course, that's the location where so RPG Research, the community center, has allowed us to meet here. And as Hawk was involved in starting both, it's been fun to have some overlap there. But the Tolkien Society focuses mostly on the written works of Tolkien and what it inspires, which of course then has a connection and bleed into role-playing, various different role-playing systems that have been over the years based on Middle-earth, as well as popular media, etc. And that's a nice segue maybe to go into if anyone has any other kind of current news on anything Tolkien related. Anthony.
Yeah, I just have 2 items of information. One is that the illustrated edition of The Hobbit, specially illustrated by j.r.r. Tolkien himself, will be released in September, specifically September 19th, 2023. This follows on the special illustrated editions of The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, illustrated by the professor himself. And so that'll kind of complete Tolkien's sort of quote-unquote trilogy of his main legendarium in Middle-earth. So, and then another interesting piece of item, or news item that I picked up was that it relates to the Rings of Power television show. Supposedly, Orlando Bloom, who played Legolas in Peter Jackson's Hobbit and Lord of the Rings trilogies, will be cast in the 2nd season of the TV show as Orifer, Legolas's grandfather.
That's a really cool casting decision.
That is very interesting.
Because obviously they can't make him look younger. I always think it's always interesting when they went from the Lord of the Rings movies to the Hobbit films, which I don't speak of very often. But it is interesting, you've got both Gandalf and Legolas kind of reprising their roles. but of course they're older, so how do you make them look younger?
Yeah.
Whereas this is believable because it's been now 20 years since the Lord of the Rings
Yeah.
movies came out, so he's 20 years older. He could, with a little makeup, easily pass as Legolas's grandfather.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I love because that whole that I've actually had some connection with that with role playing is that Orfer is part of one of the battles where elves and men, I can't remember which one of the Dagors it is, but they go fighting up against the orcs, etc., up north, and Orfer at that point kind of takes his people who are Sindarin, and they go to, they're small number, but they go to Mirkwood.
Yeah.
And this is where Orfer kind of starts to rule over the Sylvan elves there, right?
Yeah. Originally it was called Greenwood the Great. But,
Greenwood the Great.
Eventually it became corrupted and became Mirkwood, which, by the way, Tolkien got that name from the Poetic Edda, which we'll get into.
Hey, nicely done there. I see. Yeah, absolutely. So we'll get to the Elder Edda or the Poetic Edda here in a little bit. But great connection there. Okay, so the Rings of Power series, Orlando Bloom, and a bit more on another Tolkien-related book that will be coming out this fall. Anybody else have anything to mention that's related to Tolkien news-wise?
I've got two.
Okay.
There are two video games that are going to be released in May. One of them is by Electronic Arts, so it tells you how quickly licensing gets underway.
Yeah.
Wow.
And based on, I know someone who works for Electronic Arts down in Austin, and he kind of hinted off the record that Electronic Arts had some of these games lying around for quite some time that they had never released or marketed because they don't have the rights or licensing to, and now they're just they asked and they got approval to get them released. So the first one is Lord of the Rings Heroes of Middle Earth, which will be on iOS and Android on May 10th, which is a standard role-playing game. But the second one is the one that is more interesting to me, is this Lord of the Rings Gollum game, which is described in its trailer and commentary on several websites as something of a choose your adventure game between the decisions that you make as Smial and the decisions you make as Gollum. And as you choose good or choose evil, different things happen in the game, which would be quite interesting. I think I might get that as my son is starting to get into game playing age, and
Sounds fun.
go play it through and see what happens.
Okay, Chris, that makes me, I have to ask this is more of a throwback Thursday question, but oh well, it's not Thursday, but we'll ask it anyway. What, if any, video game did you first play that referenced Middle Earth? So there was a text game that I played in 1985 or 1986. It was, so for those of you who know Zork, it's a kind of text game. It was called The Hobbit, and you loaded it in with the old floppy disk, and I heard that laugh, and you onto the Apple IIe, and so it would, I think it was a green screen at the time, and green screen, by the way, back then was not like this green screen that no, it's like a monitor with only green text is what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Thank you. I hear an amen. But anyway, literally you would give text commands, and then you'd get up to the Misty Mountains, and you're Bilbo with the dwarves, And the dwarves would go ahead of you and you would get lost. And then every single thing that you tried, no matter whether it was, look for tunnel or go north or go south, it would always say you were lost in the mountains. And I never solved the game. I was so upset at that. I'm like, well, forget this, man.
You got to start over and start mapping.
It was like the Oregon Trail. Yes, that's a good idea. It was like the Oregon Trail. You got sick and died of a dysentery. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. You know what I'm talking about. So does anybody?
I didn't. I reduced the chances of illness to 0, and I reprogrammed it. The game was programmed in BASIC on the Apple IIe, so I gave myself what was it, 32,000 some hundred bullets, because you couldn't go higher than that.
Oh my goodness! What? You hacked the game?
Yeah. Why not?
You hacked Oregon Trail?
Why not? It was in BASIC.
Why would you need 32,000 bullets to shoot the buffalo? Now we know why there's no more buffalo. It was Chris Cooperstein.
The better question is why not?
You got that right. But I don't think I did any Tolkien game, Hobbit-related games until all the way forward into the original PlayStation years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
All right. Fair enough.
yeah,
I've played those
I
too.
was a late comer in that arena, but I had a bunch of other games that I played that were not Tolkien related.
Okay. Anybody else? First Tolkien video game played? Was there one that you played?
Yeah, it was the Hobbit, but I don't remember if it was for PlayStation 2 or if it was for PC. But
were there good graphics?
yeah.
Yeah.
So it was very interesting. I really enjoyed it because whenever I would get mad at the game, I would just pass it to my sister and be like, "Hey, you try." And we actually took turns, and it made it more of a 2-player.
Okay. Yeah, that's fun. Thanks, Joey. John?
Lord of the Rings MMO. I think that was the title of it, but I'm not 100% sure. But it was a Lord of the Rings massive multiplayer online role-playing game.
I think that's still going.
It might be. I haven't looked at it for a decade.
It is.
I believe so.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure it's still going. So, did you enjoy that, John?
I did. But what I enjoy more is going through the Minecraft. I think it's called EA. It's there is a Minecraft simulated world for Tolkien, and weirdly enough, there's now going to be a Dungeons and Dragons Minecraft game.
Yeah, I actually will confess, since you mention it, that I have the Lord of the Rings mod for Minecraft, and that's a lot of fun to play because there's factions, and you can earn, different. You can basically become an ally with different groups. So I'm an ally of the Rangers, and so I can hire Rangers to fight with me against the orcs, etc.
I thought you would be an orc.
Okay. All right. Well, if there isn't any other Tolkien news in the modern day things, it looks like maybe Gary, you had something to share. Gary,
Brian, I've got something for the promotional
yeah, go ahead.
thing. I just want to mention about, as far as games, I'm not into that, but I lost
That's okay.
several good dive partners while I was on Okinawa to gaming, and anyway. But I don't hold it against you guys. Okay?
Thank you.
Anyway, as a member, I get this every month. I'm in Hen.
I'm on hen. Yeah.
Yeah, and in the February issue, it's the first time I saw something like this because I'm a relatively new member. They've got something called Mathon, which I think is a museum.
Yeah.
Oh, the Matham.
Matham, yeah. Yeah, they're like things that you would want to put in a museum would be a Matham. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Michael Belby.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, in the February edition, there were four Smials mentioned, okay? And two were in England, and one was in Hawaii, and one was in North Carolina. So, you know, we're not the only ones around.
Yeah.
My suggestion is see if we can put something in here
Oh.
that they would do this. And then at the same time, I unfortunately subscribe to Facebook, which is now called Meta. And not because I like Mark Zuckerberg, but it's interesting and it does show a lot of things, including they got one there, the fans of Middle Earth. And I can contact them and see if we could just put a little blurb in there, you know, and try to.
In
because
case,
when I found this group, it took a little bit of work.
Yeah.
It took a little bit of work to find it, and so
there might be people from Spokane or just anywhere in the Northwest, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, that might love to, you know, if they're on that Facebook group.
Yeah, in Oregon, or you know, it's who knows? We might get a Canuck too.
Yeah. Bring on the Canadians. We'd be glad to
hey,
have
I'm
them.
Canadian.
Yeah, there you go.
By citizenship.
So anyway,
We'll tolerate you.
if somebody would send me, you know, what you think should be in that, and I'll run it by you when I'm done with a little promotional blurb.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that would be Hawk or that'd be Brian or that'd be Anthony, but
We'll talk together and
Yeah.
and see what Hawk thinks, and then we'll get that to you.
Yeah.
okay. And you've got my email if you don't have my phone number.
Yep.
Yeah, I've got your email as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a really good idea of, you know, trying to expand our outreach and advertise ourselves more if we want to kind of expand our group.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's people. I mean, I've run into in my life. I've run into people who just are Tolkien fanatics,
Oh, yeah.
and you know, want to discuss it more.
Yeah.
And we're
Yeah, I don't
you know,
s-
we're a serious group, so
Yeah.
Yeah.
you know, I just been mulling it over ever since February about that. So.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thank you,
Yeah.
Gary.
Thanks, Gary. Okay, so Anthony, do you want to go ahead and maybe start our focus on the Edda as the next influence on J.r.r. Tolkien?
Yeah.
Do you want to make any kind of introductory comments at all before we get started?
About like Norse mythology or
Anything you wanted to. I will say I have not read the entire Poetic Edda, but you, I think, have just finished it.
Yes, I finished it.
So you're probably the most well-read on this. Has anybody else here read large portions of the Poetic Edda?
Sometime in the 80s.
I read a little bit of it.
Yeah, I think so. Most of us have read excerpts.
Yeah.
Maybe the things that refer very, like, literally or specifically to some of Tolkien's inspiration.
Yeah, exactly.
But give us the big picture. You just finished it. What were your impressions of the this? So, what is the Elder Edda or the Poetic Edda?
Okay, so the Poetic Edda is probably one of our primary and oldest sources of our knowledge of Norse mythology. So the Norse being, you know, ancient and medieval Scandinavians. I have a book here called The Norse Myths, A Guide to the Gods and Heroes by Carolyn Larrington. If you want to get a good introduction to kind of Norse mythology in general. But so the Poetic Edda, also known as the Elder Edda, is a collection of poems about the various gods and heroes in Norse mythology. Sort of like Beowulf, it actually survives in a single manuscript called the Codex Regius, or the King's Codex, and which was produced probably around the 1270s. But the actual poem or series of poems themselves are much older, probably stretching back to what historians usually call the Dark Ages, but I prefer to usually just call it the early Middle Ages. And so, the Poetic Edda is written in Old Icelandic, I believe, or Old Norse, and it's had an interesting sort of provenance. Like I think the manuscript itself was considered lost. It's actually a copy of an older manuscript, and so it was, I think, purchased by either the King of Norway or the King of Iceland, which is why it's called the Codex Regius in like the 17th century.
I'm pretty sure that would be the King of Norway.
Or yeah,
Because when Iceland tried to rule on its own, they never had it was more of a democratic
so
structure. So I think
Yeah.
when the King of Norway exerted his influence, it would have been
Yeah.
him. Yeah.
Yeah, so the Codex Regius was written during the 13th century, but nothing was known of its whereabouts until 1643 when it came into the possession of Beowulfur Sveinsson, the then Bishop of Skalholt in Iceland.
Is there any connection with Snorri Sturluson? I always hear his name.
Oh, yes. So Snorri Sturluson was an Icelandic scholar and poet who lived roughly at the same time as the manuscript was produced, I think a little bit earlier. And he wrote what was called the Prose Edda, in which he quotes good portions of the older Edda, the Poetic Edda.
Okay, so that's the distinction, is that we have a Poetic Edda, which is older,
Yes.
and a Prose Edda, which is younger and which references the older source material.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
The word Edda is The word Edda is interesting. Like, we're not quite sure what it means, but it may be connected with the word Other, which means poetry or inspiration in Old Norse. And so
I wonder if that's where we get the word oath from, because I know oath is an Old Norse word.
Yeah, potentially.
So something to do with words.
Yeah, poetry, poetic inspiration, and so Edda kind of denotes a specific type of poetry which would have been recited by, skalds or court poets in Iceland and some of the Scandinavian.
So the idea and I know that these terms mean something, so sometimes we throw them around. Epic poems, lays, sagas. There's some distinctions there, right?
Yeah, and the Poetica is not quite an epic, because epic usually means like following a single hero.
Okay, like in the Greek.
Yes, or the story of Sigurd, which is a major part of the Poetic Edda, and also the saga of the Volsungs.
Okay, which we'll get to probably next month.
Yeah, for sure. But here, Edda, kind of, the Poetic Edda is just a collection of, stories and poems about the various gods and heroes in Norse mythology. So
Okay, so kind of an anthology, not
Yeah,
about
exactly.
one specific person,
yeah,
but it's kind of like a corpus. It represents
Yeah.
a body of legendary literature.
exactly, and sort of like maybe the Homeric epics, or maybe even Beowulf. These stories would have probably been told orally and passed down generation to generation, before attaining their written form.
Wow.
Sometime in the Middle Ages.
Very cool.
Yeah,
Thanks, Anthony.
you're welcome.
Anybody have a comment on that before we kind of dive into looking at the Edda? Yeah, go ahead, Joey. Here's the microphone.
So, from what I took from it, the last thing he said about basically the Anthony.
Yeah, what's that, Joey?
Could you remember repeating that last part?
About the Poetic Edda?
Yeah.
Oh, sort of like how in the Homeric epics, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, as well as Beowulf, perhaps, were told orally. Would have been probably originally told orally by different
Okay. Yeah.
performers or poets. Passed down before being written down.
That is how most of the stories were lost, because back then that's their main focus of telling stories.
Yeah.
At least that's what I was told from a Norse pagan side of it, that he lost most of it. Well, most of their most of it. I thought I would just point that out.
Yeah, thank you, Joey. Yeah, so Joey was talking about how a lot of these stories could have just been lost over time because they were in an oral form and never written down. But also, there were a lot of manuscripts that were, written about the Norse that were just perished either in fire or deliberately by during the Christianization of Scandinavia.
Yeah,
So-
it's really interesting to compare both the oral transmission as well as when you write things down. Certainly, when you write it down, it does help to preserve it better.
Yeah.
But having something written down doesn't necessarily preserve it because something might happen to it for sure. Although it's interesting to see. Oh yeah. Although it's a little more nuanced. Certainly, some manuscripts would have been destroyed.
Yeah.
But it was not always the case. For example, there were a number of efforts to record some of these stories before they altogether were lost.
Yeah.
So sometimes that was also from a Christian perspective. It depends on the age in which they were.
Yeah.
What struck me about this whole thing is it has come from Iceland.
Right.
Well, the old country, which is what people when I grew up still called Norway.
Yeah.
But something may have been written or came from Greenland. It was quite interesting. I thought that this outpost of Scandinavian society would provide this information, or maybe it's the only one that survived because it was an outpost
Yeah.
Yeah.
and it was so confined and isolated. Because if you went from Norway to Iceland, how many days would it take you by one of the Viking ships?
Yeah.
It would take you about a month, maybe a little less. Depends, because if you would stop by at the Hebrides or like northern, like Orkney, some of the northern islands off Scotland. Then you might go to the Faroes, which is north of Scotland, and then you would hop over to Iceland. So it would take several weeks for sure. But
you hope for good weather the entire time.
Yeah.
Well, I think your theory has a lot of weight to it, considering that's what we see happen with languages, right? Mm-hmm. For example, Icelandic is closer to Old Norse, even though it has changed over the years. It's closer to the original Old Norse than the current Norwegian language is. So Norwegian has changed over time more rapidly, whereas in Iceland, yes, you do have that both a remote area, but also literally the word insular, right, which means it comes from the Latin word insula, which means island.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that did have an effect. So I think you're probably right.
The same thing happened like in Hawaii. In Kauai, they speak a version of Japanese that was spoken 100 years ago in Hiroshima.
Whoa.
Wow.
They haven't really changed. I mean, the Japanese language has, but they've become more modernized and everything else. So, yeah, I think you're completely correct there.
That is just a fascinating thing. And of course, Tolkien would have been very aware of this trend. And so thankfully he was able to read Old Norse, and so he could go back and he could read the oldest sources that we have written down as far back as we can go. So, yeah. Chris Cooperstein, any comments that you want to make, or John?
I confess that I have not spent much time with the Edda.
Oh, shame on you.
Well, hopefully this will be a stepping stone that maybe you'll spark your interest.
Yes.
I will point out that I picked up a good book a couple years ago called The History of Iceland.
Ooh.
This is by Jon Hjalmarsson, a nice Icelandic name, from the settlement of Iceland to the present day. So this is kind of an interesting book as well.
Too short to be an Icelandic name.
I know,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Rather entish group of people, maybe.
Can you show me the cover?
Yeah, and I did look for any references on the Edda, but the index didn't have anything on there. So, of course, there's a lot more to it than that. But I think basically what you're saying, Gary, rings true. That you have the place where this is preserved best is not Norway, ironically, or Sweden or Denmark. And maybe can we just make a little parallel with Beowulf? Where was Beowulf written? Not where these places like Denmark or whatever, the Geats or the Yats, however you say that. It wasn't where the story was located. It was where the people had immigrated to. In that case, England, which was this kind of far outpost of the Saxons. Maybe in a way that's kind of what we have going on here. You have the Eddas being collected, finally written down, kind of in a far-flung outpost of Norse
The lack
culture.
of local storytellers, they had to bring it with them.
Yes, they did. They had to bring their storytellers with them, and they would have been in high regard back then, wouldn't they? If you could tell a good story. No cinema, guys, right? And no books. So your storytellers are in high demand. Well, let's get.
They had to have good memories, sir.
Yes,
for
they
sure,
did.
yeah.
Far better than ours are today. I would.
Wouldn't that be a skald?
A scald. That's
Yeah,
right.
I mentioned that earlier.
Okay, so let's get started, Anthony. Let's
Yeah.
dig in. Let's dig into specifically what are some ways in which the elder or poetic Edda influenced J.r.r. Tolkien in writing his stories.
Well, I think just in lots of ways. Just the sort of the Norse pantheon or the gods. I think
So this would be familiar to a lot of people nowadays because of the
Marvel films.
Marvel
yes.
films, right?
Yeah.
So Asgard, you're referring to the
Yes.
Nine Realms.
Yeah, actually in Old Norse that would have been pronounced Usgarth. Then Midgard, which is sort of our world, or which is the etymological origin of Middle Earth,
Middle Earth,
would
yep.
be our world. So Mithgarth is how it would be pronounced in Old Norse. But
Oh, that's interesting. So like the Mythgard, there's like a whole thing dedicated. I think there's is that a magazine or the Mythgard Institute? That's what it is.
Mithgarth, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah, and so a lot of Old Norse gods are, of course, maybe familiar to some of us, like Odin, who sort of appears in human form as like a one-eyed old man or wanderer. He's sort of the supreme, kind of the most prominent god in Old Norse mythology. He's sort of the god of wisdom. And then there's Loki, who, as you can probably imagine from just watching the Marvel films, is sort of a trickster. There's one story in which he supposedly became pregnant and gave.
That's awkward.
Yeah.
As a judgment on him, right?
Yeah, something like that. He's always sort of scheming and getting himself into trouble with his words. Then there's Freya, who I believe is probably the most prominent Norse goddess. And then there's a whole host of lesser gods like Heimdall and Frey, and there's also Fenrir the wolf, who was probably an inspiration for Karkaroth in Tolkien's Silmarillion, particularly the story of Beren and Luthien.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and who else can I think of?
Did you mention Thor?
Thor. That's another one I forgot. Yeah, Thor. He's sort of like a mighty warrior. He seems to be getting into sort of feats of strength, contests of strength and will, and combat.
He's the Norwegian Hercules.
Exactly.
Well, and then just going back to Odin, if I may,
Yeah.
I found very interesting. So there's a number of thoughts out there on references, like parallels between Odin and Gandalf.
Yeah.
And just in terms of their function, even though Gandalf is certainly not a god. I mean, the Valar are in a sense gods, but they're really more like powerful beings that help to bring about the creation of Arda. But they're kind of secondary. They're like powerful, but they're similar in a way. I suppose it's similar to the way that Marvel is kind of portraying the.
Right.
You know.
I mean, but Odin is. Gandalf is not known as All-Father.
Okay, so let me show you what I mean. No, you're right.
in Norse
You're right.
mythology.
It's not the same, but here, listen to this. So Odin had a legendary horse who had 8 legs and was said to be one of the greatest horses known to the gods. Gandalf had Shadowfax, who had no equal among horses in Middle-earth and could understand the speech of men. Odin's legendary Gyrd, the spear Gungnir, and the ring Draupnir could have influenced Gandalf's legendary sword Glamdring, or more likely the magic staff he carries, while the ring possibly influenced Gandalf's possession of Narya. Gandalf and Odin both receive new wisdom as a result of sacrifice, as Gandalf is brought back after his fight with the Balrog, and Odin gains power and wisdom after he hangs on the tree Yggdrasil for 9 days. One of the most apparent ways in which Gandalf and Odin are alike is that Odin took the shape of an old grey beggar with a wide-brimmed hat and grey cloak who wandered the mortal world and dealt with the inhabitants. So those are just, I wouldn't say they're the same thing, because Tolkien would not want that. He would say, whoa, whoa, whoa. I don't want people saying Gandalf is code for Odin, because he would say, no, he isn't. So we would for sure disagree with that interpretation. But the question is, was Tolkien influenced by these kinds of interesting characters? And it turns out that the name Gandalf actually comes from the Edda.
Yes, specifically the Völuspá, which is the first section of the Poetic Edda, in which there's a Cirrus. It's usually sort of translated as like the Cirrus's prophecy, in which I believe like there's Odin comes to the Cirrus, wise woman who sort of tells him, about the creation of the world and how the world might end. And
She talks about Balder dying, doesn't she?
yes, who's Odin's son. That's of course covered in a separate poem as well. But more importantly, there's a section of the Völuspá called the Dvurkatal, or Catalogue of Dwarves, which is of course where Tolkien would have gotten many of his names of some of his dwarves.
Everybody needs a catalog of dwarves.
Exactly.
Snorri.
Yeah.
I thought you mentioned that name earlier.
Yeah, so go ahead. You were mentioning the Icelandic name.
Snorri?
Yeah.
And where's his brother Dory?
No, well, not quite.
But you can see the connection, right? The
Yeah.
Icelandic sounding names. So the Old Norse names are definitely influencing there. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a translation of the Poetic Edda in front of me by Jackson Crawford, who's
Nice.
a scholar, American scholar of
Hello.
Old Norse.
Would you permit me to read one stanza in Old Norse?
Old Norse?
Yes.
Can you know Old Norse?
I've studied it a little bit.
Okay, sure.
All right, but I'll try to pick one that has actually some of the names that we'll recognize here, because I'll let you do the English.
Okay.
Okay, well.
Let's see here. I'll choose.
Puppy dog who's pretty upset. Yeah. And she threw up in the backyard.
Hey, Gary, can you mute?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Hey, I had to take a phone call.
That's fine. If you could just mute, that'd be great.
I'll be right back. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. So you might recognize a few of these words from, as I read it in Icelandic.
Talk to you later. Love you too.
Fili, Kili, Funden, Nali, Hefti, Vili, Hanar, Svir, Billinger, Bruni, Bilder och Buri, Frar, Hanbari, Freger och Lani, Arvangar, Yari, Aikens Shaldi.
Wow.
Okay. Now to the English.
Okay. Well, I'll try to read a little bit longer
Yes,
section.
please.
Yeah. So the Cirrus says, then they made Motsognir, he was the lord of all the dwarves. And next they made Durin. They made many man-like little creatures, dwarves of the earth, and Durin named them. Ni and Nithi, Nothri and Suthri, Ostri and Vestri, Althiof, Dvalin, Bivor, Bavor, Bombur, Nori, An and Anar, Ai, Mjolfvitnir, Veg and Gandalf, Vindalf, Thrain, Thek and Thorin, Thror, Vit and Lit, Nar, Nirath, Regan, and Rathsvith. Now I've named the dwarves correctly. Fili, Kili, Fundin, Nali, Hepti, Vili, Hanar, Sviur, Frar, Hornbori, Freg and Loni, Arvang, Yari, Oakenshield.
Mm-hmm. Oakenshield.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
So we see a lot of names here, don't we?
Oh yeah, for sure.
So let's see. Going back to the Hobbit, we have Thorin Oakenshield,
Yes.
who apparently in this list is two different dwarves.
Exactly, and also in the rough drafts to the Hobbit, Tolkien originally named Thorin Gandalf. If you can believe it. Yes.
Wow.
And I believe he named originally Gandalf some other name, which I forgot, but
Yeah, because Gandalf is in the list of dwarvish names.
exactly,
here.
yeah.
That's
but
fun.
Tolkien decided to switch.
I see Biffer, Boffer, Bomber,
Yeah.
Nori.
Durin.
Yeah, Durin, of course, the father of the dwarves. Owen,
Thrain.
Fili, and Kili. I mean, he's almost got the whole list here.
Yeah, practically. Yeah.
Balin, son of Fundin. So there's Fundin there.
Yeah.
Wow.
Dvalin or Dwalin.
So that would be a very obvious influence here, is that he's trying to pick out names that would give a certain feel
Yeah.
of the. And why would he do that with Old Norse for the dwarves? What would be the reason for that? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, what is it? C.S. Lewis said has a certain amount of northernness, which denotes things like courage and also, you know, warlike if they had to be, and stuff like that. And I thought that was very, very interesting as far as it went. I mean, this is the mythology of the people in Scandinavia and Northern Europe for the most part. And that's where he's basically set the scene for his books.
Yeah. Yeah,
I
good.
wonder, when Tolkien studied this first, whether it was for World War One, even, that this list had been on his mind for quite some time, or whether he kind of came up with the story first, and then he was working on he said, I need a list of dwarf things. And then I remember that I had come across this list in some of my research. So did the story come first, or had he already had the list that kind of started to self-generate the story?
The chicken and egg.
Yes.
Cool. I'm thinking that his interest in languages was probably the initial part, and he became interested in the Scandinavian, old Scandinavian words. I mean, he translated Beowulf,
Yeah.
and then from there, I guess in the 30s, he decided to write The Hobbit, and that was the first.
John?
And after that, The Lord of the Rings.
I see a lot of influences, and I've always seen this influence before we were looking at this part, of the Scandinavian. The elves are more related to the Nordic elves than the Gaelic spirits. They the dwarves are based on the Nordic things. Some people have tried to say that they're Yiddish, but it's obvious to me that they're more Nordic than anything else. And the writers of Rohan are basically Vikings, but on horses instead of ships. So
That's interesting.
and which is interesting. He wanted to have a English legend, but he took a lot from Norway, and I don't see a lot of Gaelic in there, except for maybe Tom Bombadil influence in the stories. And I'm wondering if there is any more evidence of any Gaelic or local legends being brought in. I definitely see the Nordic stuff, maybe because I'm Norwegian and that's why I see it, but
Yeah.
that's what I wanted to say.
Great comments, John. This is from Doug Wilson's website, but he says, kind of touching on what Gary and John both shared, but Tolkien wanted to, Tolkien's affinity for the North was fundamentally linguistic. He was a gifted philologist, and his love of language was what made his motor run. He commented on the impact this had on The Hobbit. The magic and mythology and assumed history in most of the names, I believe they give the narrative an air of reality and have a northern atmosphere. From Letters, page 21. Tolkien wanted to write a mythology which he could, quote, dedicate simply to England, to my country. It should possess the tone and quality that I desire, somewhat cool and clear, be redolent of our air, the clime and soil of the Northwest, meaning Britain and the hither parts of Europe, not Italy or the Aegean, still less the East, and while possessing, if I could achieve it, the fair elusive beauty that some call Celtic, or Gaelic, though it is rarely found in genuine ancient Celtic things, it should be high, purged of the gross, and fit for the more adult mind of a land long now steeped in poetry. So that's really interesting, kind of how he's trying to evoke something here through the choice of what names to use.
I think the most English representation of anything in The Lord of the Rings is the Shire.
Yeah.
But the rest seems to be more Nordic. That's what I see.
Well, and in a way, isn't it just like in the Shire where you see things like mailboxes and, I mean, they kind of, it's almost like a Victorian agricultural time period.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you go outside the Shire and you're going literally back in time where
Yeah.
there's less it feels older, right?
Oh yeah.
And I think in a way it's almost like that where Tolkien loved the kind of English countryside, but in a sense there's all these ruins, there's all these like ancient things that came before.
Yeah.
Even like the locations, like some of the names in Eastern England, the words for the names of the places still have Viking parts to the names.
Right.
Anything that ends in by, like Grimsby or whatever, those are all referring to, those are Viking names. And so even the names left behind have that kind of Norse kind of influence. But again, it's more than just Norse. So he's really kind of meditating on how his land was this kind of, I don't know, like this place that was influenced by these older cultures that are now gone. In a way, maybe that's kind of how he sees Middle Earth. So
Would you say there's any Roman influence? Because that they were just as influential to the formation of England as the Nordic peoples who came
Yeah.
over.
And Anglo-Saxons.
Yeah.
yeah, it's a great discussion point for maybe another time because there's a lot there. The name Britain comes from Latin, Britannia, what the Romans called it.
London or
London, yeah. But I think what he did want, right, was to create a mythology for England because England was so often kind of this Heinz 57 of different things. He wanted something which could distill those down into one unified story and legend. So anyway, maybe back to the Edda.
Yeah, sure.
So you mentioned a number of things there with the gods. What else can we pull out from? We read from the Voluspa. Voluspa.
Before you go on, I just got one remark, and that is Aragorn.
Aragorn?
The hero in The Lord of the Rings.
Aragorn? Aragorn, yeah.
It's from, I mean, as far as I know, Aragon is the region that King Ferdinand of Spain came from.
Well,
that's good.
It was what he was king of before he and Isabel took over the whole country.
right. Yeah, that would be Aragon. But the character, the name is slightly different in The Lord of the Rings. It's Aragorn, son of Arathorn, with an R. There's another fantasy novel called Aragon,
Yeah.
but that's different.
Okay, well, my mistake then.
No worries. But I mean, honestly, I think you could draw connections to all these different societies.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to see. So again, Europe, all these influences, Tolkien. It's interesting that he doesn't point to the South. He says it's not like the vibe or the feel of the Mediterranean, like the Spanish or the Italian, and it's certainly not the East. He says even less the East.
Despite the elephants.
Yeah, he likes the elephants. But but he does get to this northernness thing, which you mentioned before, Gary. Kind of C.S. Lewis refers to this. May I?
I mean, as far as the northernness, the Vikings were there after the Romans were. You know, there was hundreds of years different because the Romans cleared out in what, 5th century or something like that?
Yes.
And the Vikings didn't show up until like the 10th century.
Yeah. Yeah, and in between
It
there were
started raiding, I believe. So,
yeah.
you know,
At some point, could I
it's
read
more current
from
with the Vikings.
That's about Balder. Just
Yeah,
a short little poem.
Excellent point.
Okay, so where next, Anthony? When in looking at the Edda, do we want to talk about something? You were talking about the gods.
Yes.
I have something on Balder, but that could wait till a little bit later if you want.
Sure. I noticed, of course, when I was reading the Poetic Edda, I came across the name Mirkwood, which...
Oh, wow.
That, of course, lit a light bulb in my head. So Mirkwood in Norse mythology, I just have to... there's a glossary, actually, in the back of my translation, which is really helpful for all the names, because sort of like Tolkien was a master at nomenclature and naming things, and I could see where he got it from, because it seems like there's just a plethora, an encyclopedia of names in Norse mythology.
So even the desire to like name everything is maybe
Yeah.
a Norse thing.
Yeah. So Mirkwood. Interesting. Okay. So in this glossary toward the back of my translation, so Mirkwood in Norse mythology is the anglicized name of Old Norse Myrkvathir, which is a famous forest mentioned in several forms, associated vaguely with the south. What I think, based on what I read, it could mean like some of the Germanic forests, like the Black Forests in Germany and stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Wow,
So
that's interesting. I never thought about that there could be a connection between.
Well, didn't the Eddas, the two, the prose and the poetic, also mention the German legends?
Yeah. So maybe there's more of a connection than we realized.
Yeah, and there's also a connection. There's also references in the Poetic Edda to like Attila the Hun and the Goths and the Franks and the Lombards. Lombards were actually the inhabitants of Italy in the early Middle Ages, you know, the 700s, 800s. So I think, you know, based on... What's that?
What are the Goths?
Oh, the Goths. The Goths were sort of like a Germanic people inhabiting modern-day France and Germany in the early Middle Ages, you know. Sort of not long after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD.
And he borrows some of the Gothic languages or word roots for I think Rovanian and
Oh, really?
There's a whole kingdom that he borrowed. Let's see, it's north of Gondor. It's the one time there was in his legendarium. There's I think a prince of Rovanian, which is the area of land east of Mirkwood, and that's that's the part of the story where the king of Vidugavia, a prince of the Northmen in the 13th century, the Third Age, his daughter married the son of the king of Gondor, and then there was a huge civil war that erupted over that kind of because the union of that wedding was seen as a half-breed.
Right.
But anyway, I just want to point out that he used Gothic as well to refer to a Far Eastern people that had influence and alliances with it. So.
Did you just pull that out of your head?
Sort of.
Man, you have like an encyclopedia of Tolkien knowledge.
Not that
impresses
far. Maybe just a abridged version.
So yeah, and the Vikings, they weren't entirely contained within Scandinavia. They would have cross-pollinated with other cultures and of course colonized England. They were part of the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine emperors, and they would have also interacted with I believe Arabs. I mentioned Vikings in some of their writings. They would have been traders.
Absolutely. So we're talking about.
Yeah, well, they traded slaves. They brought slaves to the Arabs.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, and also.
They also made it down to modern-day Russia.
Yes.
So
Pretty far flung.
Yeah, and also of course the Normans were originally Northmen or Norse.
That's right. Vikings riding horses.
Yeah.
That speak French.
Yes.
That's terrifying.
Yeah. Oui, oui.
Definitely the Rover in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So Mirkwood, you mentioned. You mentioned the way in which the Viking. So the Edda mentions all these different parts of the European world at that time, right?
Yeah. I don't know. We could go on and on about the parallels, but where Tolkien could have gotten influences, like for Valhalla, of course, which is the Hall of Heroes, sort of like the Halls of Mandos.
For a lot more drinking.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And
I noticed on the book review that I saw online at mrsdalloway's.com, there was a book review on a book called The Poetic Edda, a book that inspired Tolkien with original illustrations. And this was like the book that Tolkien would have read.
Yeah, so you must. Yeah, I saw that too, and that must have been like an older translation. Or
I
something
think so.
Yeah.
It also mentions the names of the dwarves, and it says riddle games. That riddle games are in the Edda.
Yes.
And the paths of the dead, which I found fascinating, that would crop up in, and that would be a whole nother, like, maybe that's something we could follow up with next month if we don't know, if you don't know where that is right now.
No.
But like the paths of the dead, like, okay, well, where did that show up in the Edda? You know, I'm very curious.
Probably several places, because with the Norse Edda and the earlier one, a lot of it was glossed over many times throughout many of the actual stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe we can come back to that. And then also it mentions here an underworld creature being tricked into remaining above ground until dawn when sunlight turns him to stone. Let's see what else. It mentions elves, of course, the list of dwarves.
Nordic trolls traditionally turn to stone in sunlight.
Yes, Nordic, that's right. So it's a Nordic troll trait to turn into stone upon sunlight. So that's itself not realized. A lot of us don't even realize that that's where that comes from. And then also a dragon called Fierce Stinger. I don't know where that comes from. I'm just
What is it?
referencing. Yeah, there's a dragon in the Edda as well at one point.
Fafnir, which you could.
Oh, is that what Fafnir means?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
so the dragon Fafnir is the dragon that the hero Sigurth slays in sort of that latter half of the Poetic Edda.
So we'll have to get back into that,
Yeah,
especially
sure.
next month, because so Tolkien wrote a book called Sigurd and Gudrun, right?
Yeah, the legend of Sigurd and Gudrun,
Okay.
which contains sort of his own reinterpretation of the legend of Sigurd and Gudrun. And and you can find connections between that and the story of Turin Turambar, another hero who's sort of cursed and faces a mighty dragon named Glaurung. And so,
Well, lots of good stuff in there. Wow. Was there also a dragon at the bottom of the tree?
Yes,
Yes.
there was.
And I believe didn't they actually mention him in Tolkien work as well?
The dragon that chews at the roots of the world tree.
Was
Yeah.
that a Balrog?
No, I don't.
Okay, I think that's from the Rings of Power, where they had the
Oh yeah, the whole thing with the.
Balrog and someone else fighting over the
Yeah.
main tree there.
Mithranium.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Well, yeah,
that's completely made up. That.
yeah.
Yeah.
So the world tree is called. So yeah, there's a world tree in Norse mythology called Yggdrasil.
And it connects all 9 of the realms, correct?
I believe so.
Right.
Yes.
Yep.
There's also a rainbow bridge that connects between Valhalla and
Heimdall.
Yeah. No, it's called Bifrost.
Yes, no, but Heimdall is of course the guardian of Bifrost.
Yeah. Heimdall. So.
What about the ages of first, second, third, and fourth ages of Middle Earth, as they talked about? I'm wondering because I saw this thing about what is it? The first entry in the the poetic Edda is Voluspa.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about earlier.
Pronouncing it correctly.
Voluspa.
Yeah. Anyway, it's supposedly, and I read, it's creation and death, or end and rebirth of the world,
Yes,
which in a way looked like Ragnarok, which I
Yes.
never know.
that's
except,
right. Yeah.
Except for the Marvel movies.
Well, yeah, we have to go back and say, it's like so easy when the things that are made most recently are foremost in our minds, but we have to go back to before that and
Yeah.
see
Yeah.
Look at
these
the
stories.
first-
I remember reading about Ragnarok when I was a child and loving the Norse mythology, right?
Yeah.
And even just that there would be this rebirth where after everything was destroyed, then there would be one man and one woman, and they begin again.
And that actually translates over to Christianity, I believe. A little bit.
Yep, there's
Armageddon.
death and resurrection. So
Armageddon.
yeah, I think there's a certain sense in which there's definitely several different ages there, and you could even make an argument for how those people who were writing down these stories also saw this as a previous age, and that they were the inheritors of that age. So it was kind of like their story and yet a legendary past. So much like how Tolkien saw Middle Earth as not being some other world somewhere far away, but actually this world far, far, long ago in a galaxy actually very close by. So I would love, if I may, just to read something that inspired C.S. Lewis
Sure.
briefly. This is actually from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow,
Oh.
and it's his translation in English of the Swedish poet called Tegner, who's actually, in his own words, in poetic form, retelling the death of Balder. But it's a Scandinavian poet from the 1800s who was part of the Romanticist kind of time period, and so it gives that vibe of northernness because it's somebody from the 1800s trying to mimic the stories going back to the Middle Ages. And so it's called Tegner's Drapa, and C.S. Lewis actually read this. It was his first encounter with northernness. So I want to read it out loud because of the audio quality, just the wording of what it's saying. And think of this and think, what does this convey to you? I heard a voice that cried, Balder the Beautiful is dead, and through the misty air passed like the mournful cry of sunward sailing cranes. I saw the pallid corpse of the dead sun borne through the northern sky. Blasts from Niflheim lifted the sheeted mists around him as he passed, and the voice forever cried, Balder the Beautiful is dead, and died away through the dreary night in accents of despair. Balder the Beautiful, god of the summer sun, fairest of all the gods, light from his forehead beamed, runes were upon his tongue, as on the warrior's sword. All things in earth and air bound were by magic spell, never to do him harm, even the plants and stones, all save the mistletoe, the sacred mistletoe. And it goes on and tells the story a little bit more. But here's the part you're referring to there. So perish the old gods, but out of the sea of time rises a new land of song, fairer than the old. Over its meadows green walk the young bards and sing. Build it again, O ye bards, fairer than before, ye fathers of the new race, feed upon morning dew, sing the new song of love. The law of force is dead, the law of love prevails. Thor the Thunderer shall rule the earth no more, with threats challenge the meek Christ. Sing no more, O ye bards of the north, of Vikings and of Jarls, of the days of Eld, preserve the freedom only, not the deeds of blood. Anyway, going back to comments from Joey and others as well, like there's this multiple age thing going on, but also this deep sense of mourning that Balder is dead. There's something beautiful there. Comments?
It seems like
Joey?
it seems like that they with back then they knew how to actually not waste a word with their poetic or their poems and stuff and their storytelling. even a tragic event, of trying to show that they care about each moment more than a lot of people here nowadays.
Wow, that's a
Yeah.
profound comment. Thank you, Joey. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So why don't you take us to maybe kind of what else you wanted to share about the Edda before we move on to Tolkien's letter?
Yeah, going off what Joey was saying, like, Tolkien, I started reading Tolkien's book, The Legend of Sigurd and Gudrun, and Tolkien said that Old Norse poetry sort of like hits you in the eye with force, and I could definitely see what Joey's comment there about how, the Norse never minced words, or they didn't waste a word really. They were always sort of on target with their poetic meaning and their word economy. And the source of kind of what the poem that Brian just read can be seen in Baldur's Dromar, or Baldur's Dream, which is a section of the Poetic Edda. It's not part of the Codex Regius manuscript, but it's actually part of a different manuscript, and it translates to Baldur's Dreams. And it's a poem that tells about how Odin goes to this witch, sort of like how he goes to the Cirrus in the Voluspa, the Cirrus' prophecy, and he has these. He's kind of told of his son Baldur's death, because he sees a lot of weeping, and
Everyone weeps, right? Even just like the lowliest thing weeps.
Yeah.
Except for one. Loki.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I could definitely see where what Longfellow and that Swedish poet got their source from was Baldur's Dromar, Baldur's Dreams, section of the Poetic Edda.
Cool. Thank you for sourcing that.
Yeah.
I wonder why Marvel Universe didn't bring in Baldur. They do all the other gods, but they never bring in Baldur. They could have easily made that part of the story, and then Loki, it could have been part of showing how Loki's a villain. He kills off Baldur, it would have...
I think they are planning on.
You think they'll bring in Baldur?
Yes, because if
Just
you look
wait a
at...
couple months or a couple of years.
Because if you think about it, they have the Loki series,
That's true.
and having the concept of going back in time, altering reality,
Oh.
and the fact that they literally show the stones being nothing but like paperweight stone.
Mm-hmm.
I can see him coming in and actually saying, "Hey, I was trying to figure out how to deal with the situation. Let's see," and basically only showing up until much later.
Yeah. Could be. Maybe they will bring it in somehow. Okay. So any last thoughts on either from Gary or Chris or from Anthony about the Edda before we move on?
The only thing I've got is I did see this one comment that, and it's I think before I came on here from the letters in 55 and 56 Tolkien letters, was that Tolkien was not happy with the Nazis and what he called the Furor Teutonicus, which was the Aryan counterfeit or whatever they spoke that at that time. I guess it helps to know Latin and all this other stuff. Mm-hmm. Anyway, he thought that had perverted, had despoiled the whole North myth in many ways, and it bothered him to no end, supposedly. Yeah.
I can see that. I mean, look how this could easily be pulled into critical race theory right now.
Yeah.
And it's like that's in a way, because some people have twisted it or whatever, it ends up making people assume things that are not true. Mm-hmm. There is Tolkien certainly had nothing to do with Hitler. He wanted to preserve a sense of pride and longing in a cultural northernness, which clearly to him wasn't racial, but it was more about character, like courage. When you, to me, I think a lot of this goes back to those who lived in the North had to deal with inhospitable environment. So courage was maybe the character trait that was most valued, whereas maybe in a Mediterranean climate, being charismatic may have been more of a more desirable trait, based on where you live. But in the North, that would make sense to me why courage would be like a predominant trait, because of the landscape. It influences them.
Where survival is easier,
Yes.
you're relying less on having to be courageous and strong.
Yeah. Could you say it again for the microphone, John?
Where the climate is easier, as in the Mediterranean, you have to rely less for your survival on being strong and courageous. You can relax and let your charisma be more important to you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay,
Yes.
ready to move on?
Yes.
Okay. I believe we are at letter 213 in the letters of j.r.r. Tolkien.
That's correct.
So if everybody wants to pull out, if you have a copy of, I don't know, is that your own copy?
No, this is Hawks. So
That's
you can have-
Hawks?
Yes.
Well,
I have a copy on my iPad.
okay. You want to look at that, John?
Sure.
That way everybody has a copy to look at. Let's go to letter 213.
Yep, this is letter 213.
And Anthony, if you wouldn't mind, once everybody's got their place, why don't you start us out?
Okay, everyone, ready? This is
I
letter.
think Chris may be still getting his, but I'm
Oh,
not
okay.
sure.
We'll wait for Chris. Unless you want to start or start.
Oh, there he is. Okay.
288?
Letter 213.
Right there.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead there, Anthony.
Yes, this is letter 213 from Tolkien from letter to Deborah Webster, 25th of October, 1958. Tolkien writes, I do not like giving facts about myself other than dry ones, which anyway are quite as relevant to my books as any other more juicy details. Not simply for personal reasons, but also because I object to the contemporary trend in criticism with its excessive interest in the details of the lives of authors and artists. They only distract attention from an author's works, if the works are in fact worthy of attention, and end, as one now often sees, in becoming the main interest. But only one's guardian angel, or indeed God himself, can unravel the real relationship between personal facts and an author's works. Not the author himself, though he knows more than any investigator, and certainly not the so-called psychologists. Oh boy. But of course, there is a scale of significance in facts of this sort. There are insignificant facts, those particularly dear to analysts and writers about writers, such as drunkenness, wife-beating, and such-like disorders. I do not happen to be guilty of these particular sins. But if I were, I should not suppose that artistic work proceeded from the weaknesses that produced them, but from other and still uncorrupted regions of my being. Modern researchers, quote, inform me that Beethoven cheated his publishers and abominably ill-treated his nephew, but I do not believe that that has anything to do with his music. I agree. Then there are more significant facts which have some relation to an author's works, though knowledge of them does not really explain the works, even if examined at length. For instance, I dislike French, sacre bleu, and prefer Spanish to Italian, but the relation of these facts to my taste in languages, which is obviously a large ingredient in The Lord of the Rings, would take a long time to unravel, and leave you liking or disliking the names and bits of language in my books, just as before. And there are a few basic facts, which, however dryly expressed, are really significant. Do you want to keep going, or let's?
Yeah, why don't you finish the paragraph?
For instance, I was born in 1892 and lived for my early years in the Shire, in a pre-mechanical age. Or more important, I am a Christian, which can be deduced from my stories, and in fact a Roman Catholic. The latter fact perhaps cannot be deduced. The one critic, by letter, asserted that the invocations of Elbereth and the character of Galadriel are directly described, or through the words of Gimli and Sam, were clearly related to Catholic devotion to Mary. Another saw in Waybread, or Lembas, viaticum, and the reference to its feeding the will and being more potent when fasting, a derivation from the Eucharist. That is, far greater things may color the mind in dealing with the lesser things of a fairy story.
Okay, let's stop there and discuss this first section of the letter. Going back up to the top, Tolkien speaks to this person, Deborah Webster, about the contemporary trend in criticism in 1958. So, what thoughts do we have about this idea that in order to know a writer, you really need to know, you need to know the psychology of the writer in order to understand what they wrote? What do you think about that?
Well, this knowing the psychology, knowing where he got his references from and where he's thinking may help you understand the works better in some cases. But as he's pointing out, there's been, and this is even more of a trend today,
Absolutely.
where the personal life of the artist cannot be separated from the art. And we now judge the value of the art on our judgment of the person itself rather than whether or not they had anything good to say. Even the worst person on the planet said something correctly once or twice in their life.
A broken clock is still right
Twice a day. Yeah. So this is where it's getting me now. There are, just as an example, there's a lot of people who do not want to have anything to do with the mythos and the Call of Cthulhu books of H.P. Lovecraft, because H.P. Lovecraft was supposedly a horrible person in his time.
Well, yeah.
Which does influence, his view of the world does influence his stories.
Sure.
But you can read the stories separate from the person.
Yeah. Well, I think
seems to be what Tolkien is saying here, right?
yeah.
Yeah, that's what I got from it. And the fact that this was in 1958, having the exact same problem that we're having in 2023 is pretty impactful to me.
Yeah. Well, I think specifically the charge against H.P. Lovecraft he wasn't that horrible of a person, but he was sort of a racist, at least in his earlier part of his life, although he kind of softened his racism in later years. But yeah, I kind of agree in that today we definitely don't seem to be able to disentangle the life of a creative artist from their personal life. You can see this in, various, cover stories of People magazine or, various other magazines like Vogue or something like that, where maybe they'll profile an artist or an author or whoever, and kind of delve into their personal life, which, I don't think it's necessarily a crime to do that, but
No. I think it's good for us to know some things about
Yeah.
a person because it definitely sheds more light on them. But it does see, and I think Tolkien is onto something here.
Yeah.
And I think I agree with John. I think it's gotten worse. But
Well, I agree with you folks too. However, knowing something about a person's motivation,
yeah.
okay, can provide understanding of why they wrote it. In other words, Tolkien did not like all the new technological world. He harkened back. He's very nostalgic about pastoral England. Okay? Yeah, the Shire. That was his idea of the best place. I think even more than where the elves lived in Rivendell. So yeah, it's a double-edged sword, but somebody's a real what would you call it? I'd be profane, but a real shitbird. And you may not like him as much, even though what that person puts out as an artist is is phenomenal. So
Yeah.
it does influence your opinion.
Well, I think it's
I'm not saying it's good. It's there.
yeah. That's. I mean, I think it's the difference between maybe, you know, understanding human beings as an integrated whole. Everything written or created comes from a context that makes
Yeah.
sense. It doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
But I think that the earlier understanding of human motivation would have been like, okay, so there's the World War I. This influenced, Tolkien, and so that can be seen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the particular Freudian kind of mindset that says, well, there's all these hidden things, and we just need to. What we're seeing on the top is really not the real reason. There's this hidden stuff. Maybe it was because of, what's the trope? Well, Tolkien had a problem with his mother. His mother died when he was young, so therefore this then explains everything, which is kind of a another way of kind of oversimplifying things, which is what Tolkien, was against, because again, with allegories, it's not that you can't find.
And he hated allegories.
Yeah, it's not that you can't find truth and connections and make and build bridges of understanding and meaning. It's that it was oversimplifying and destroying the nuance. And when you confuse the artist's life and their work, and basically there's complete overlap, that, logically doesn't even make sense, because that would make it sound like, well, if the person was a really good person and a great neighbor and a wonderful friend, that everything they create is also good. I'm sorry, there's stuff that people create that's maybe average, even if they're wonderful human beings. So I think that we need to be able to disentangle these two things and recognize that while it's valuable to know about a person's background and to be able to comment on that and saying, hey, Edgar Rice Burroughs, there's some troublesome things we see, for example, in his view of different people. But let's treat that as a criticism of the person.
Exactly.
Now, let's talk about Tarzan. What does, in this story, these stories, maybe there's a lot of great things. Now, of course, if this author really kind of, in a sense, is preaching a bit more, or is more, maybe it's more obvious that a particular view they have, which we don't agree with, is very present in the story, then we're going to have to engage that. But let's engage with the work as it stands.
Yeah.
So, all right.
I think Brian, I think those are wise words. However, we live in the age of cancel culture.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, which
you make a mistake and
yeah.
if you're not in total agreement, they come after you.
But the problem with that, of course, is that it's actually very arrogant, because it's saying, well, I never make mistakes.
Yeah.
Really, who can stand? Nobody can. If you're going to have.
Yes, we are a country of armchair theologians in each other's
Yeah, and
lives.
philosophers.
And
We prejudge.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Myself is equally guilty.
Yep.
And so one of the ways that I know a person is to go back to the sources, meaning instead of looking at a news article about the person, actually see what he wrote. Go listen to his speech in its entirety, rather than the sound bites that we use to spin one way or the other the news about someone.
But
So,
that takes patience, Chris, and independent thinking. What are you asking
Yeah.
for?
Yeah, right.
well, I am asking for a thorough judgment, or a thorough weighing, rather than instant
Knee jerk.
truth.
Yeah. TikTok videos and
And,
tweets.
I have found that very helpful in creating nuance,
Yeah.
where people love to not have nuance.
Gary?
Yeah, what I was going to say is you have to realize too that a lot of the best artists, no matter what their field was, were real buttheads. I mean, they were disasters as human beings, but
Yeah.
they were also very creative.
Yeah.
And I don't know
The
how much
people-
we're missing now
Yep.
because
People have been able to create good things, and in order to do that, they may have had some other significant character flaws, which
Yeah, for
which
sure.
we can acknowledge, but at the same time recognize the worthwhile contributions of their art. And I think a lot of this is trying to avoid being stained. You know, like, well, if I like this work, then that is somehow associating me with this person's view, and I think that is an unfortunate association. But I'd like Chris, if you wouldn't mind, to finish up. We've got one more paragraph from letter 213. If you could read that, Chris, if you'd like to.
Sure.
It starts with "I am, in fact."
Yes. I am, in fact, a hobbit in all but size. Hear, hear. All of us. I like gardens, trees, and unmechanized farmlands. Smoke a pipe, and like good plain food, unrefrigerated, but detest French cooking.
Oh man.
I like and even dare to wear these dull days ornamental waistcoats. I am fond of mushrooms out of a field, have a very simple sense of humor, which even my appreciative critics find tiresome. I go to bed late and get up late when possible.
Here, here.
I do not travel much. I love Wales, what is left of it, when mines and even more ghastly seaside resorts have done their worst,
Yeah.
and especially the Welsh language. But I have not, in fact, been in Wales for a long time, except for crossing it on the way to Ireland. I go frequently to Ireland. Southern Ireland, being fond of it and of most of its people, but the Irish language I find wholly unattractive. I hope that is enough to go on with.
yeah, I think what he means there, Chris, is Southern Ireland versus Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
Ireland,
Yes.
which is Northern Ireland is, I believe, still owned by the British.
Yeah. It's still a constituent country of the United Kingdom.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And, Southern Ireland is, of course, the Republic.
I find
of
it
Ireland.
odd that he detests French cooking, and his son Christopher goes and marries a French lady
Yeah.
and goes and lives in France.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder how he.
Well,
He felt about that.
like that
Vive la contradiction.
regular diet that you would see, and
Sorry, go ahead and say that again, John.
he preferred that, if forgive the word, plainer diet that you would find in a English pub, as opposed to the rich, extra spices of the, the extravagance of the French.
Yeah.
Plus, I just like the English cheeses better, but that's just me.
I like
the Irish cheese.
I prefer
Irish
everything
is good.
Italian. I prefer Italian cooking, so
Wow.
because I'm Italian.
But the French were famous for, as far as their cuisine for small portions.
Mm.
Yeah.
Maybe
they're-
that's what he didn't like.
Well, well, I think everyone.
I'm hungry.
So
What about second breakfast, Pip?
well, yeah, I think pretty much everyone's portions in the world is probably much less than ours. That's for sure in
Yes.
the United States.
Yeah.
Hence our high
So
obesity
it-
rate.
Well,
If you go back to the first sentence, I am in fact a hobbit in all but size, and then you go through this list, you see a lot of similarities between the author and his little hobbit friends, that they don't travel much and they love Wales and they don't like development.
foreign
No.
foods.
Yeah. So it's a very
Yes.
Want good English ale.
yeah, it's a very provincial attitude. I
It is
think.
very provincial, yeah.
Yeah.
But he's admitting it, isn't he?
Yeah. At least he's honest.
Yes.
He knows what he likes.
Yeah.
He said non-mechanized farming. Is he talking about being all blind of horse-drawn plow or what?
Yes.
Well,
Yeah,
out here in the South Farthing, I keep watching all the farm workers go and prune by hand all of the grapevines for all the vineyards. And that's something that simply can't be done by mechanized means.
Yeah.
But if it could, they would do it.
If you talk to the wine owners,
Yeah.
no, they wouldn't.
Well,
And they would choose not to, not because of the profit issue, but because of the loss of jobs. They would want people employed.
it
Until
can't
we
be
get bought
done.
out, get bought out.
Okay.
Well, we are almost to 3 o'clock, so I wanted to just ask if Hawk had any comments he wanted to share. We're talking about the Edda, the Elder Edda or Poetic Edda. Next month, what we'd like to do is connect to the. So Tolkien wrote Sigurd and Gudrun.
Yeah, the legend of Sigurd and Gudrun.
And that Sigurd is part of a larger story, which is the
Yeah.
Volsungus saga.
Yeah, the saga of the Volsungs and of course. Parts
And
of
is that in the Elder or is that in the Prose Edda?
the saga of the Volsungs? Well, I mean, those stories are told in both of
Okay.
the Eddas, but it's its own work. Also,
So kind of, all right. So we'll kind of do the Eddas part 2 with a focus on the Volsungus saga, and really the story of Sigurd and
Gudrun.
and is Fafnir's in there as well, correct?
Yes.
Right. So I really don't know much about this hero. I'd like to know a lot more. So
Oh.
in the next month, hopefully we can all get a chance to learn more about that. Any last comments from Joey or John? Okay. How about from Gary or Chris?
I'll get. I don't know who's your point of contact, but as far as that promotional stuff, who to get with?
Yeah, we'll email you that. We have to talk to Hawk first about that, and
Okay,
we'll
sounds good.
we'll try to do that in the next week or so.
Yeah.
Alrighty.
And Anthony,
No, I just want to say thank you all for coming, especially for our gracious host Hawk Robinson, for her founding this
and our nice little studio here.
and our nice little studio. Yeah, Hawk, did you want to say anything? Or? Okay. Yeah, if there's nothing else, I'd like to say to all of you, have a great weekend, be well, and Namarie.
Namarie.
Namarie and happy Easter.
Happy
Yes,
Easter.
Happy Easter as well.
All right, so next meeting will be in